more and more, I think because we've accomplished so much and I feel more confident, I like to introduce myself as a fuck-up who just keeps on trying. Because we've made practically every mistake in the book, but we keep on learning. And Kim, I was really somewhat glad but also embarrassed that you put my old paper up there. I'm so glad that probably most of you have not read it. We had a 5-year, $5 million plan for 15 years. Pretty much every prediction, I think I was right about the general stuff, but every single prediction that I made about how long it would take, how much it would cost, was all wrong. But, we learned as we were going. Eric Vermetten is not here, so I'm going to just indicate why. His family said that he's traveling so much, and I'm leaving on Monday to Switzerland. We're having a fundraising meeting there to try to raise money for phase 3 in Europe. And so, unfortunately, Eric will be there, but he won't be able to be here. So lately I feel like I'm a bull with the red flag, and I'm tracing it, but that red flag is dollar signs. So I'm constantly doing fundraising because I think we've accomplished so much that we really are at the place where the regulatory obstacles have fallen away, and we are doing really pretty well with the training of the therapists. To give you one sense of where we're at, and I'm going to try to leave a lot of time for questions, but to give you one sense of where we're at, after we had obtained breakthrough therapy designation from the FDA and we negotiated with them about moving to phase 3, we decided to come to Europe. And so we had a meeting that took us about 6 months, but we had a series of negotiations with the European Medicines Agency, with their scientific advice working panel. And basically what you do is you give about an hour or so presentation. There's about 15 people there. Okay, I'll do that. This is probably easier. All right, so there's all the experts from the European Medicines Agency, and then we had a bunch of people there that were presenting data, and we had several people that were on the phone from our office in Santa Cruz. And so after the meeting, then we went off, and those of us that were at the meeting, we went off and we discussed what was going on, how we thought it went. And then we got a call from our staff back in Santa Cruz, and they said that the European Medicines Agency Scientific Advice Working Party had made one small mistake, which was that they'd forgotten to turn off the phone lines. So our staff was able to listen in on the deliberations after their meeting. So, I do sort of somewhat embarrassingly pride myself on being sneaky. And I would not have done that intentionally, but I'm glad that they didn't turn off the sound and that our staff continued to listen. So the main thing that we learned from overhearing their discussions was that they felt that we had established safety. That was the main thing. They were not worried about neurotoxicity. They were not worried about anything else, that we had established safety. The main thing was going to be to establish efficacy. So we thought that was very reassuring in view of, as Ben used to say, said that we used to have these endless discussions about neurotoxicity and would one dose cause permanent brain damage and major functional consequences. So the European Medicines Agency, not only that, but they agreed with the FDA that there's no solution to the double-blind problem. So that was one of the key issues, is how do we move forward with a methodologically sound study that would be accepted by skeptics. And in our phase 2 studies, we tested a lot of different doses, from 0 to 25, 40, 50, 75, 100, 125, 150 milligrams. And the goal of that was to try to find the dose that was enough activity so that it would cause confusion with the full dose, but not so much therapeutic potential that it would make it too difficult to see a difference between the two groups. And so that's basically what we did for around 10 years, trying to figure that out. And what we discovered, to my dismay, was that my dissertation was wrong and that I thought I had solved the double-blind problem. And so I was correct in the sense that I think the best placebo for psychedelic research is a low dose of the test drug. And what I'm about to tell you now may not be true for psilocybin or LSD, but it is true for MDMA. So what we discovered is that the low doses in the range of 25, 40, and 50 milligrams did produce blinding, so that was terrific. But at the same time, they made people uncomfortable. And they actually reduced the effect of the therapy without any drug. So people still got better, but they didn't get as much benefit as if they'd had no MDMA at all. So therapy plus inactive placebo works better than therapy plus low-dose MDMA. So the question is, how do you do this kind of double-blind study? And one of my favorite quotes was from an early president of Harvard, and he said, "Never forget there's always a Harvard man on the wrong side of every issue." And so I opened up the meeting with the FDA and I said, in this case, it's me. My dissertation was wrong, there's no solution, and you could either choose blinding or you can make it more difficult for us to try to show a difference. Because the real question is, if you can do with therapy adequate work, why bother add a drug? So really what we want to test out is, does therapy plus MDMA do better than therapy without MDMA? And we have to sacrifice the blinding. And so what FDA and both EMA that eventually agreed on is that they would have us compare MDMA with inactive placebo versus MDMA with active MDMA. I mean therapy with active MDMA. So I think that's going to be challenging for sort of academic scientists who will say, the double blind didn't work. But what we also learned from FDA, our officials and our consultants, we're fortunate that we have the former director of the FDA Division of Psychiatry Products helping us as an advisor. And he said that the dirty secret in pharmaceutical drug development research is that the double blind fails in practice a lot of the time. There's side effect profiles that people know. It's not as clear as you might think it is. So how do you eliminate experimenter bias? That's the main thing that the double blind is supposed to accomplish. And so there's two main approaches now, both FDA and EMA have accepted. The first one is obvious, it's random assignment. But in some ways it's not that obvious. Sometimes a lot of studies are done with people that have failed on previous treatments, and then we take those people who volunteer to get something new. And then you say, well, they did way better than the others. But they volunteered, they're more enthusiastic, they're more willing, they're different from the normal baseline population if you only work with volunteers. So you have to get everybody that's ready to do the same thing and then randomly assign them to your control condition and your test condition. And then the other thing that they said is the system of how you evaluate the outcomes. It has to be very complicated because first off, you need to say, obviously, the therapists don't get to rate the patients. We have to have independent raters, and these independent raters, the system that we had in phase 2 was that we would have one rater per site, and they would track a subject from the very beginning through, get their baselines, then at each time point after the first MDMA session, after the second, after the third, and then the 1-year follow-up. And so what FDA said is you have to break the connection between the raters knowing where the subjects are in the study protocol. And so what that means is instead of having one rater per site, we have to have a pool of raters that are somewhere 20, 25 different raters who are then randomly assigned to the next patient at whatever site they're at, and they do that through telemedicine, over the internet, through Zoom or some HIPAA-compliant platform. And so on the basis of that approach, where we have random assignment and we have this kind of more complicated aspect of doing the outcome ratings. The other thing that the FDA said, which has been a problem for us, is that we used to take everybody through the study and then break the blind on an individual basis. So after people had had their second MDMA session and then they had their primary outcome measure, which was 2 months later, then we would uncover the blind, and whoever had the placebo could go right again through the study and get therapy plus MDMA. And so that, they felt, would somehow or other, if we did that in phase 3, that would be disclosing to the therapist somewhat where the remaining people might fall, which groups they might fall, placebo or MDMA. And so we can only break the blind now once the entire study is over. And so that's been a problem for us because we have now enrolled 50 subjects in our first of phase 2 studies for the US. Each we think will have about 100 subjects. And we've already had 4 people drop out of the study. So that's a problem, but what it turns out, based on our hunches, and again, we haven't uncovered the blind, but it seems that every dropout was from the placebo group. And so first off, I'm saying it is pretty obvious to tell. But it's not that obvious. So I want to say that we also give MDMA to therapists as part of their training. We have a special protocol to do that. We've had 79 people in that study so far from all over the world. And we've had so it's 4 days where and we're training people to work in a double-blind controlled study. So in these 4 days, one day they get either MDMA or placebo, then there's a day of integration, then there's a crossover, they get whatever they didn't get the first time, and then there's another day of integration. So we've had 2 situations where people had been through our earlier parts of our training, meaning that they had done this 14-hour online program, and then they'd watch videos for a week of actual MDMA PTSD therapy patients, and they've talked about our therapeutic method. And so they kind of knew how people reacted to MDMA. They knew what our approach was. And so these were people who were had never MDMA naive, super excited about trying to experience MDMA for the first time. And they felt super lucky that on the first day they got the MDMA. And they go through their experience. They go back to childhood. They work on really difficult issues. They're even sort of nystagmus in their eyes sometimes, just different kind of physiological symptoms. And they're just really doing great work. And then the next day they do a lot of integration. And they persuaded themselves that they had MDMA, that the therapists who are very experienced also thought they had MDMA. And then when they did the crossover, they were speechless after they took the drug. As it turned out, they were completely wrong, and that they had confused the placebo with MDMA. And Eric Vermette, who's not here, was one of those people, and he's told his story several times about that. So what he basically, the funny part is when he actually realized he got MDMA, he couldn't speak for several hours. And he would point to the books on the shelf that were in that room, and he was like, you know, like it's in the heart, it's not in the books. And what they realized, these 2 people, both of them were psychiatrists. So this is a psychiatric phenomena. Both of them were psychiatrists, and they both felt that they were able to will themselves into processing the way in which they thought MDMA would help you process. And so the good news from that is that you can go a long way without the drug. So I think that's really, really important. But when they had the MDMA, they both said that it was more effortless. It was more a deeper flow, and that they were able to even go deeper with the MDMA. But I think what we're now trying to do is to instruct all of our therapists to prepare people for this study, is that if you end up getting the placebo, you know, don't give up, don't be despaired. You can actually make progress with the placebo. We have had one person in our study so far attempt suicide twice during the study. So we are working with chronic, severe, treatment-resistant PTSD patients. And so we felt that we have to work with the hardest patients first because of all the social stigma, and also to convince other PTSD researchers. And so this woman had attempted suicide, had a lot of suicidal ideation before, and then in the study she attempted suicide twice. And so she has since dropped out of the study, and it turns out we believe that she was in the placebo group. We haven't actually uncovered the blind yet, because we're asking the FDA if we can accelerate her transition to the next phase where she would get MDMA as part of therapy. So most PTSD studies exclude people who have actively attempted suicide. And so we feel that we must include them. And so it's also clear from our FDA experts that a lot of people with severe chronic treatment-resistant PTSD will commit suicide. And we know in the US there's roughly 20 veterans a day committing suicide. So it may be that we give MDMA to this woman if we get permission, and she may end up still deciding to commit suicide. And if so, that's not going to shut the study down. That's just going to be a demonstration that it doesn't work for everybody. But we have very careful procedures to track somebody after they've been treated. We call them every day on the phone. It was a week, every day for a week. Now it's going to be 4 times in the week. They can come in for extra meetings. So we create this very strong surround for people in order to help them process the trauma. But, you know, and we're taking this risk, but we think it's worth it. So we've got this incredible treatment. You've heard both from Kim and Ben what's going on now. There's one thing, one question that was asked to Ben about working with adolescents. And so we have, I like to say it this way, the FDA is requiring us to work with children. If we actually succeed in adults, we are going to have to work with 12 to 17-year-olds. And these are called phase 4 studies. So they're commitments that you make post-marketing. And if it works for 12 to 17-year-olds, it'll work. Then we have to go down to 7 to 11-year-olds, children that are traumatized. The EMA also asked us to enroll migrants and refugees here in the European study. And the reason I think it'll work in kids, how many of you have heard about the octopus study? Okay, a bunch of you have heard about it, but not that many. So I'll just share briefly that octopuses and humans diverged around 500 million years ago from evolution. And so Doblin, who's a neuroscientist at Johns Hopkins, decided to see how deep does this effect of MDMA go evolutionary. And so octopuses are generally solitary creatures unless it's mating season, in which case they're not that solitary. But most of their lives, they're solitary creatures. And so the experiment is that they have 3 chambers. There's an octopus that's free to move in the middle chamber. On one chamber, they can go off, and there's a little small cage, and in it is a ball, an inanimate object. On the other side is another little small cage, and there's an octopus in it, which can't move but has to stay there. So under normal conditions, the octopus will spend way more time with the inanimate object than the other octopus. And then when with the other octopus, they're kind of around the edges of that side of that cage. They're not really interacting with the other octopus. So they figured out, it took them a little bit of time, but they put MDMA in the water, and they would soak the octopus in this MDMA water, and it would absorb MDMA. They do that for 10 minutes, and then they stick the octopus back in this experimental contraption, and then lo and behold, the octopuses hang out more with the other octopus. So even if it's a male or a female, male, however you switch the genders, you give the octopuses MDMA, they spend more time with the other octopus. So what that means to me, and what that means for children, I think, is that it's pre-verbal. It goes so deep into our structures of our brain, this pro-social behavior, that it will work in children who don't have the ability to articulate a lot about what's going on. So that's, it's hard to translate sometimes from, animal studies to human studies. I will share, Ben shared some stuff before he was in medical school. I'll share a story before MDMA was illegal about a family that I was friends with. They all decided to do MDMA together, and they had a 7-year-old daughter. And so they gave her half a dose. And so there's not that much data on kids with MDMA, so this is anecdotal data. And so I met this family the very next day, and I ended up talking to this little girl, and she was, there was a couch, and she was hanging backwards on the couch, with her head to the ground, her hair going down, and so I figured, okay, how am I going to talk to this little girl? I said I did the same thing. So I got on the couch, we're both hanging down upside down talking, and I was like, well, what was MDMA like? And she said, well, it was kind of interesting. I was up in heaven, and I was watching my mother before she got pregnant with me, getting ready to have me as a child. And I'm like, did you really think you were up in heaven? And she said, I don't know, it's just what it seemed like. So it was great. She wasn't, telling the story for attention. She wasn't super attached to it. So I'm actually looking forward to this, hopefully succeeding in adults and then moving to work with children. Because, what drives the drug war, it used to be Tim Leary turned into non-dropout, counterculture stuff, and, people are going to challenge what's going on, and that's faded over time, and now it's really parents worried about their children, and that's what the drug war is driven on. And so for us to have to do some work with children and hopefully show that it's beneficial, I think is going to be a strong statement, that it's not about the drug, it's about the context, it is about the dose, but we'll see. So we will have to do that kind of work. I want to tell you a super brief story about what it means to have PTSD and go through the treatment. I got a call several days ago from one of the veterans that was in our study, and he's made tremendous progress. He had attempted suicide 5 times before being in the study, and now he's doing really, really well. And we've actually hired him to be an emissary to the Department of Defense and the Veterans Administration. And so he was talking to, he was at a group where there's a senator, Republican senator, so we're doing a lot to reach out to Republicans. We're not trying to dose President Trump. Although, and actually I don't think it would work. Well, I think the main point to say is that you have to be willing to go through something. And if you're not willing, MDMA is not going to work. So the irony here, and this is where, to get back to drug policy reform, is that I think it will be easier to change the minds of the 40 or 50 million people that are voting for Trump than it will be to change Trump's mind. So what we actually need is mass mental health. And so that's why both MAPS and Beckley Foundation, among the groups, have really been focused both on doing medicine, but also talking about drug policy reform. And also talking about fundamental human rights, that we need to go beyond people having access to this either through medicine or through religion. They should have access directly. And what I think that's going to end up meaning is that the clinics that we're going to be setting up, and there will eventually be thousands of these psychedelic clinics, people will be cross-trained in ketamine and psilocybin and MDMA, and hopefully we'll get it covered by insurance. But I think what's going to happen is that we're going to get the hardest cases will come to the clinics. And the other kind of cases, people will work with their friends. They'll work with therapists that maybe don't work at these clinics, but that people will do this work trying to heal themselves. And so unlike a normal for-profit pharmaceutical company, we're in a way trying to undercut our own business by making it possible for people to get access in other ways than getting it from us. So I think that's really important. So the story that I want to tell is about John Lubecki, who I just mentioned. So after he was through the study, this is now about a year ago, he was doing pretty well. He'd been out of the study for about a year, and in his backyard there was a little bit of a pond, and there was a landscaper on a riding mower that was trying to mow the lawn of all these houses that attached to the pond. The guy went too close to the water. The riding lawnmower fell over and trapped the guy, and John went in and rescued him and gave mouth-to-mouth and tried to resuscitate him, and he died in John's arms. And so he called us up then, and he said, I'm worried my PTSD is going to come back. And so he ended up not being able to sleep for a couple nights, and slowly he was able to calm himself down, and his PTSD did not return. So last week he called me. He said he had just met with this Republican senator to celebrate. He and his friend went to the bar, and after they left the bar, he was going to his truck, and he saw a woman giving CPR to somebody not that far away. So he went over to help, and it turned out, this is in Charleston, South Carolina, that the person on the ground had been shot twice in the chest by a drive-by shooter who was actually driving by on a bicycle and shot this guy, and we don't know exactly why. So John tried to really save this guy's life, and again, this person died in John's arms. So, John, from PTSD, from being in the war with gunshot wounds and all of this, he was really worried, again, that this would re-trigger his PTSD. But it didn't. And we talked to him the next day, and he said what he learned from the therapy is how to process his own trauma. And that instead of suppressing it, if you can keep on... Oh, nice. Well, okay, and so instead of suppressing his trauma, he was able to learn how to process it. So I think that's what we're really talking about, is helping people learn how to process trauma, and also they keep getting better on their own. And so now we're trying to do a lot of pharmacoeconomics about how do we get the insurance companies to cover it. So our basic model is 3 MDMA sessions, 1 month apart with these 12 non-drug psychotherapy sessions, 3 for preparation, 3 for integration after each one. But it seems like going forward, the standard model is going to be 2 MDMA sessions, not 3. Some people will need more. What we've been able to discover so far is the factors that have influence on non-responders or slow responders is the first one is how long have they tapered off their SSRIs. So the longer they've tapered, the better they seem to do. And then the second one is on the scale of dissociation. So if you are traumatized, one of the successful strategies is to sort of separate yourself out from what's happening. It's not that successful in the end, but it sometimes helps people to survive the trauma itself. But then you find you're disconnected from your experience, and whenever you try to get back to it, it's painful and traumatizing. And so people can't move beyond. So the higher people score on the dissociation scales, the longer it takes for people to recover. So those are our 2 main factors that we found out so far. And so one of the things also that we have to do in phase 4 is going to be studies on relapse and also on non-responders. We have managed to raise roughly $34 million for phase 3. And so we're not sure if we've raised enough money. What's going to be happening in February is, well, let me just say, the system that we're working with, drug development, has been heavily influenced by pharmaceutical industries lobbying Congress to make these procedures so that they're set up for the pharmaceutical companies to succeed. So we're kind of following in that wake. So, you know, the more I learn about this, the more I learn about how we're getting all sorts of help. And so what I thought for a long time, one of the things when came the paper that you showed, one of the things that I thought then is one of the big challenges is you need to get statistically significant evidence of efficacy. And so I thought you have to design the study to be large enough so that you'll get statistically significant evidence, but you don't want it too large because roughly $50,000 per patient is what it costs us in the US to have everybody in the study. You know, half the people go through the study again. You know, once the double blind is open, there's all sorts of monitoring costs, a lot of therapy. In any case, everybody, it's quite an expensive process. So you kind of want to hit this spot where you've got the right amount of people, but not too many. So what I've learned since then is you don't even have to worry about that. So you're permitted to do what's called an interim analysis. Oh, okay, 1 minute. I'll say this very fast. Okay. So you're permitted to do an interim analysis. So you have a data monitoring committee that takes several people. They can take a sneak peek at the data, and all they're going to do is tell me a number. So the number will be 0 is you've got enough people to get statistical significance, or you have to add 10 or 20 or 30 people, or whatever it is. So the big question for us is going to be, can we afford to add the extra people? And if we can, then we'll get the drug approved. But what that means is that the effect size is lower than we thought, if that's what happens. So that will mean it will be harder to get insurance to coverage because it's more expensive initially. We think 100 people is going to be enough. And we're fairly confident about that. You know, we don't have any real data at this point that we've enrolled half the people, but it's looking pretty. The informal impressions that we're getting back are people who seem to be getting MDMA seem to be getting better. So in any case, we're going to have this interim analysis that will take place probably February, and that will tell us more or less what it's going to cost, how many subjects, and what our timeline is for FDA. And so by June, July, August of next year, we're hoping to have all of the sites up and running in phase 3 in Europe. So, you know, it may be a little bit longer, maybe around that time, and what that means is that we're working in now, the Czech Republic has gone first, I think in part because of the legacy of Stan Grof and others where so much psychedelic research was there. So we've got approval there, we're almost got approval in the Netherlands, we're doing work in other countries, but from the time of the interim analysis, if it looks good, then we'll have about 6 months to raise the rest of the money for Europe. So Europe, US, as I said, will be about 34 million. Europe is about 10 million because the EMA will accept all our data from the US. So it's incredibly efficient to do the work here. And we're also in touch with a bunch of tech people and major donors. So our fundraising, as our story gets better, our fundraising gets easier, but the amounts of money we have to raise get larger. So in a way, it's not exactly, it always seems hard, but we have better tools and a better story to tell. So I think that if we have a good interim analysis, we have a good chance of raising this additional 8 million, and then we'll be able to start rolling out in Europe. Some of the, I just want to briefly acknowledge Stan Grof, who is really where this all comes from, my mentor. Psychedelics are the study of the mind, what the microscope is to biology and the telescope is to astrology. This to give you a sense of just how things are changing. This was a discussion at the American Society for Clinical Psychopharmacology in May, not too long ago. So this is a slide prepared by the FDA. So they've got Maria Sabina, they've got mushrooms, ayahuasca. And so the FDA is really excited about all this. And the FDA has all these guidance documents that help pharmaceutical companies develop certain kind of drugs or botanical medicines or all aspects of it. How do you deal with the what's called the special protocol assessment process? Guidances for everything. And now they're working on a guidance for psychedelic drugs. And they've asked us to help them with that. So the FDA is really behind this. Just what I think is going on right now, we're having a little bit of a hard time with our protocol to do expanded access. So while we're moving with phase 3, there's so many people, there's 8 million people with PTSD in America, roughly. You have permission, a program called expanded access, which is compassionate use. And so people can get access to MDMA without a double blind, but they have to pay for it. And the data doesn't count for making the drug into a medicine because there's no double blind or there's no placebo-controlled group. So we're negotiating about expanded access. We're also negotiating about a new study to train therapists by giving them MDMA instead of the 4 days, because now we're training people for situations either post-approval or expanded access where there's no control group. So we're trying to make it into 2 days where you get MDMA, everybody knows you get MDMA, and then a day of integration. So the FDA is giving us a hard time, a little bit. And so what we really think is going on, and what we kind of have some good information, is that we're no longer communicating directly. The FDA is no longer, in their minds, is no longer communicating with us. They're communicating with future congressional committees that will investigate how did these drugs get approved. And so what they're trying to do is create a written record of them being extremely cautious and asking every conceivable question that they have to ask. And then we just have to answer them in a long way. And then eventually we think we'll get the permission to do what we want to do. Because what's going on now in America is congressional investigations of how did OxyContin get approved. And what's going on, because we have this massive opioid overdose problem, and so the good news in this is the FDA thinks we might actually succeed. And so they want to be prepared if we do succeed, how will they be viewed by members of Congress who are nervous about it? So that's how we're viewing these kind of slowdowns. Very quickly, we also benefit from something that Ronald Reagan did. He didn't do much that's very good, but he did provide incentives for developing drugs that are off patent, called data exclusivity. So that means nobody can use our data for marketing a generic for 5 years. If you do studies in kids, you get an additional 6 months, and it'll take FDA at least 6 months to review an application, so we get another 6 months. And in Europe, it's 10 years of data exclusivity. So now all of a sudden we're thinking that, and this has been key to our fundraising strategy, is we can tell donors, if you help us make MDMA into a medicine, we're not going to constantly be always coming back to you for more money. It'll take a while for us to stop doing that, but we're going to be able to generate a certain amount of money from selling MDMA. And so this is our structure. MAPS has created the Public Benefit Corporation, so it's a big question about capitalism, and you look at profit motive in healthcare, it's distorted everything. In America, we have higher per capita expenditures than anywhere else, but our outcomes are way low because so much of the money is siphoned off to insurance companies and middle people like that. And so what we're suggesting is the whole healthcare industry should switch. It can still be for profit, but it should be maximizing public benefit over profit. So we're trying to model that. And so people donate to MAPS, we invest in the Benefit Corp. Benefit Corp is run mostly by a bunch of women who came over to us from Novartis. So we have an incredible team. This was a talk I gave at Harvard Business School. And so this is where I'll leave you with, and then we'll have questions. So this is the future development of MAPS, potentially. So this is the nonprofit at the bottom. So the dark lines are things that MAPS will own or control. So at the very top is the Public Benefit Corp. So that's now about 38 people. MAPS is about 25 people. So that's why I'm doing fundraising all the time. We've got over about 60 people working, all funded by donations. So MAPS owns the Public Benefit Corporation 100%, and that's where all of our research is done. And they also will run expanded access and our therapy training program. In order to make MDMA into a medicine in Europe, we had to start a European company. So that's MAPS Europe, based in Netherlands, with Eric Vermetten. He said he could be on the board of directors, but the only condition was we couldn't pay him. Because he's got a government job, he could only do it for free. So we said, okay, sounds good. And then there'll be future global companies in other countries. And then in the future, we're thinking we might have other benefit corporations that we would set up for cannabis, ibogaine, and ayahuasca. And we have an incredible good situation, and then I'll be done with that, which is that we've just added a woman, Victoria Hale, to the board of directors of MAPS. So basically, I do not like adding people to the board of directors because then they're my bosses, and then they might say, don't do this, don't do that. And there's a bunch of things that I could imagine they might want to say, don't do this and don't do that. So I don't like adding people to the board. But Victoria came to us in an amazing way. So when I started MAPS in '86, no drug had ever been made into a medicine by a nonprofit. That didn't happen until 1999, and that was the abortion pill RU46. So a controversial drug abandoned by the pharmaceutical industry, and it was funded by the Rockefellers, the Buffetts, and the Pritzker families, very wealthy, all three billionaire families. Shortly after that, Victoria started the largest nonprofit pharmaceutical company called One World Health, and it was to develop drugs for Africa. And she got $150 million from the Gates Foundation and succeeded in making some really important drugs for parasites, for other things, into medicines for Africa. Then she got a call from the Buffett family, and they said, would you like to do this for contraceptives? Because the Buffetts have been, as I said, the RU46. So they wanted to develop low-cost contraceptives around the world, and so Victoria said yes, she'd like to do that, and so they funded her also with enormous sums of money, and she made hormonal IUD into a very low cost, into a medicine. Then she started, for some reasons, personal reasons, experimenting with ayahuasca. And she found that ayahuasca was super helpful for her, and now she wants to make ayahuasca into a medicine. And so she has now joined the board of directors. So we've got this now, all these links to institutional credibility and her access to resources, to knowledge. So we feel even more that we will potentially expand in these ways. We're working on what's called a pre-IND package to FDA for ibogaine. We're also trying to get a standardized supply of ayahuasca, but these are just small things we're doing because the main thing is trying to make MDMA into medicine for PTSD, and then the most efficient things we would do after that, assuming that works, is other indications for MDMA, like what Ben is doing with alcoholism, with social anxiety, with end of life, eating disorders. We're starting a new study. And the one that I'm most excited about of all these, though, is we're starting a small study in group therapy. So when people start thinking about how do you really make this affordable and accessible to large numbers of people, we want to explore group therapy. All the studies that the Veterans Administration have done shows that individual therapy works better than group therapy. And it's true, there's a lot of shame, there's a lot of emotional issues that people don't want to share in a group, that they will share individually. So on the other hand, if group therapy is 80% as effective but 40% the cost, then it could be something that we want to do. Or it could be that group therapy may be more effective for, mild to moderate PTSD and severe PTSD, like the ones that will eventually go to the clinics. So we're going to start this study at UC San Francisco, and then we'll start exploring more. But the groups, when we talk about the groups, will probably just be 6 people, something like that, with 4 therapists. So we're going to start again in a very cautious way. But I'd say the main message that I'd like to leave you with is that We do have an open door at the regulatory agencies. We have incredible preliminary evidence, and we have a society that is really now open to this. And we're all traumatized every day by reading the newspaper and thinking about what's happening with climate change and what's going on with rise of authoritarianism. And so this idea of MDMA to help people deal with trauma, it's sort of the worst cases that we're focusing on, but it's really something that there's a general sense that we need more ability to process trauma and multi-generational trauma, and also have, so we're also, a great thing that we're doing is we have a police psychotherapist in our training. So to show you how much, we're actually giving, and I met with his police chief about a month and a half ago, and he got permission to go through the whole training, which means that the second part of the training is where we give MDMA to therapists. So we will be giving MDMA to police officers. And just as two sort of turns of the wheel, and then I'll be done, which is the first one is in 1990 we started working at the Veterans Administration, trying to talk them into doing MDMA research. It's not succeeded yet, but we're working with a woman, Rachel Yehuda, who is an expert in epigenetics, transmission of trauma and PTSD. She's inside the Bronx VA, and she's now super enthused about doing a study with MDMA. So it looks like we may get, for the first time in 29 years, permission inside the VA. It hasn't happened yet, but that would be transformative. The other thing is that in 2004, Michael Mithoever and Annie Mithoever got permission for the first MDMA PTSD study in the US at the Medical University of South Carolina. As it turned out, once all the permissions came in, there was a Wall Street Journal article, the medical university freaked out, and they told Michael, we're not going to let you do the study here. You can either give up your affiliation with the medical university, or you can we'll kick you out and you can do the study. So Michael said, that's not a hard choice. Goodbye, medical university. I'm leaving and I'm going to do the study. So it was really courageous on Michael's part. And then what has just happened 2 weeks ago is Michael had a meeting with the president of the university, with the chief of the Department of Psychiatry, and they said that one of their donors, who's this very conservative, extremely wealthy, Southern woman, wants them to set up a center of excellence for psychedelic research, and she'll fund the whole thing. So then they wrote Michael a letter and said, you have been very far, far ahead of your time, and we apologize, but now we want you to help us create this center. We're inviting you back. So that's what's happening all over in society. So we just have to really focus on the therapists and doing a great job, and then we can mainstream psychedelics. Thanks.